electricity and the providing of the power that this country and other countries want. It's kind of a bold undertaking to have 5 conversations on energy, and so we'll check out the sustainability of folks who want to really understand the subject that seems to be so important on our national landscape. The next conversation is on the 22nd, Wednesday night in 2 weeks, and that will deal with the environmental issues surrounding the topic of energy. The entire series is sponsored again by Dow Chemical Foundation that has been sponsoring the speaker series for a decade. So we thank them very much for doing that. Jim Guidarini is here, and he is the head of Dow operations in West Virginia, so proud relationship. I see Tom Haywood in the audience, and thanks to Bowles, Rice, McDavid, Graff, and Love. Behind me is a brand new curtain with an absolutely new logo at the top of that curtain that accurately represents the logo of the University of Charleston, and the law firm has given us that to honor one of their senior partners, Bill McDavid. So thank you for the curtain. We do questions and answers, so you are invited to write questions out on the cards that either you have already, or if you need them, you can raise your hand. They'll bring you a card and a pencil so that you can get your 3 cents worth in about what we're going, or if you have a really good question, maybe it's worth a dime. So ask you to turn off noisemakers so that they don't interfere too much with what we are doing up here. And didn't know I was going to make him do that. Okay. You take direction well. That's a good start.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. I also want to thank Charles Patton. Charles Patton is President and Chief Operating Officer of Appalachian Power. He gave me counsel about the development of this series, and he is the reason that Nick Akins is with us tonight, and he made that invitation. So thanks to you, to Charles. So our conversationalist tonight is the president of American Electric Power. He is responsible, according to his bio, for AEP's utilities, transmission, generation, commercial operations, and something he needs to explain to me, OVEC, IKEC organizations, whatever that is. He earned a bachelor's and a master's degree in electrical engineering from Louisiana Tech University. He might pronounce it differently than I do, as do you. He has participated in several executive management programs as a registered professional engineer in Texas. He was president and chief operating officer for Southwestern Electric Power Company, serving Louisiana, Arkansas, and Northeast Texas. He moved from there to AEP, where from 2006 to 2010, he was vice president for generation. And he assumed his current position in January 1 of 2011, so he's 13 months into it. So with all of that experience, I would find it helpful for you to just say, what is American Electric Power and what's it have to do with Apco, and help us to appreciate the company a bit.
Sure, Dr. Welch. It has a lot to do with Apco, obviously. AEP is, American Electric Power is an operating company that really has operations in 11 states. We operate in our eastern, when I talk about our eastern states, it's really Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. And then our western footprint is Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas. That was acquired in 2000. It was formerly Central and Southwest, and it was acquired by AEP in 2000. We also have the second largest inland barge carrier, our AEP River Operations, which you may see their boats coming up and down occasionally. They're located in St. Louis, Missouri, so we have locations pretty much all over those 12 states. And we serve 5.3 million customers in those 11 states. We have about 40,000 megawatts, one of the largest generators in the country. We also have the largest transmission and distribution network in the country. It's like I said, it's over 11 states. Many people believe that's pretty complicated, but it really isn't. We focus on meeting our customers' demands, but doing it in as efficient way as we can. And certainly from an environmental standpoint, strive to be good stewards of the environment as well. So we do a lot of things. We're obviously very focused on being a part of the communities we serve. And in every community we serve, we definitely want to be not only a part of the community, but also neighbors, friends, and so forth. And certainly if you have any questions about the business we're in, feel free to ask anyone of our 19,000 employees.
Is Apco then a wholly owned subsidiary of
Apco is
AP?
a wholly owned subsidiary. Appalachian is one of the operating companies that we have. We also have AEP Ohio, Kentucky Power, and as well Indiana, Michigan Power in the east. And then our western footprint is Public Service Oklahoma, Southwestern Electric, which I was president for a period of time, and AEP Texas. So those are operating companies that are wholly owned by AEP, along with the River Operations subsidiary and several other subsidiaries that do various things like real estate and so forth.
When you think about where you are today as a company and where we are today in this country, in our utilization of electricity and looking forward, what do you worry about the most?
A couple of things. One is the policy side tends to get way ahead of what can be rationally done in the real world. This is the most capital-intensive industry there is in the U.S. It's estimated that we'll need to spend upwards to $2 trillion just on refurbishment of the system in the next 2 decades. And to spend that kind of capital will be a challenge for this industry and for this company as we go forward. And it really does take a view of not only the company unilaterally doing things. We do want to do that. We have to work with the commissions. We have to work with the customers to really determine where to spend that capital and spend it wisely. The challenge for us is that we have a lot of mandates that we have to adhere to from the national front and from the state front, but mainly national, that has a dramatic impact on the rates of customers that they ultimately pay. And we're trying to mitigate those kinds of increases, but at the same time, I think that disconnect between the policy side and the real world is really a problem for us that keeps me up.
Talk about the capital intensity of the business. Why are you going to have to invest all of that funds?
Well, certainly to run a power system, we operate, if you think about the power system, it's a network of generators, transmission lines, distribution lines that serve the customers, and it's really the largest machine in the country. It's all interconnected, and it all has a specific purpose. And to continue to advance the growth of the system, to accommodate the growth, and continually refurbish the grid as we go forward and make new investments, it really is a lot of capital requirement associated with that. A new power plant will be in upwards to $2-3 billion. If it's nuclear, it's $7 to $8 billion. And you can't spend that kind of capital unless you have some sense of certainty that you're going to continue to recover that either from the market or from customers. That's why it's important for us to really rationalize that capital. And there's no getting around that need. You know, customers that turn on the light switch expect the light switch to work. They don't want a fast, busy signal. They don't want anything else. They want the lights to come on. And to have that kind of security around that kind of a source for energy is important. And we have to be able to meet that demand. We have an obligation to serve.
World demand for energy is forecast to go up 20 to 30% over the next 30 years. is meeting that? Is that primarily a matter of adding new plants, or is that a matter of increased efficiency, or is it research to find some other way to generate electricity? What's really going to be the answer to meet that demand?
It's all of the above. And, it's sort of interesting that President Obama mentioned that in the State of the Union address, an all of the above approach. In practice, I'm not sure that's what's happening, but it's important for us to look at everything from energy efficiency, smart grid activities, technological advances, but continue as well with fossil generation, because that is our best way and lowest cost way of achieving the capacity that's needed to meet the demand. If you look on the international front, you have about 250 million Chinese that have access to electricity today, about another billion, 1.25 billion to go. You think about the call on resources associated with that, that's going to demand that we're very efficient, but it also demands that the U.S. focus on using its own indigenous resources as we go forward. And too many times we have a policy side that turns its back on existing resources, and that's critical for our country's success around energy security.
Well, let's talk about some of those issues one at a time, I guess. You talked about fossil fuels and the use of fossil fuels. Preliminary question, climate change. Do you buy that argument? Do you believe that climate change is occurring and that human behavior has something to do with it?
Well, when you think about it, when I was growing up, I remember the population of the earth was around 3.8 billion people. Because I know that because Louisiana, where I came from, had 3.8 million, so I remember that number. And now it's more like 6.2 billion. And that means more energy resources are going to be required. So it certainly is, to that extent, a man-made issue. The question becomes whether you believe the science of it exists or not. As long as society recognizes it's a problem, we have to respond to it, and we have to be prepared for it. When you look at coal-fired generation, obviously West Virginia is very heavy into coal, just as AEP is, and this nation, 45% of the energy in this nation is from coal. If we want coal to remain in the picture, and there's concern, whether it's true or not, if there's concern that carbon emissions are impacting global warming and climate change, then we have an obligation to figure out the technology that actually supports coal remaining in the picture. And for fossil generation, it's critical for us to identify those technologies that will enable that part of the puzzle to remain in place. As I said earlier, I happen to also be vice chairman. I'll be chairman of EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute, next year. And they've done analysis that shows, in fact, that we do need everything. There's no question about it. We can't do it all with just renewables. We can't do it all with just nuclear or coal or anything else. By meeting those demands, it will require us to have every one of those tools in the toolkit.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the coal issue. As you said, 45% of production in the United States, I think, of electricity is coal-based. Mm-hmm. More than that in West Virginia.
Right.
We tend to be heavy coal. Is there really a future for coal? The forecasts are that that may go from 45 to 39, 38% or something over the next few years. What is that future, and is there anything like clean coal? Is that a reality?
Yeah, I think there definitely is a future. You move to, and you're right, the numbers are showing moving down to around 39% coal by 2020. And when you retire the existing older coal-fired units, we have units that are 40, 50, 60 years old, subcritical 200 megawatt units, which are relatively small units. You can't retrofit those economically, so they will have to retire. The question is, to what extent you retire them. Do you have a natural progression toward newer technologies, or do you force the retirement to occur, which is what the Environmental Protection Agency is trying to do today. In doing that, coal is naturally going to come down. Natural gas will be the fuel of choice for fossil generation capacity additions. We'll continue to work on smart grid technologies, energy efficiency, those types of things, but they're really marginal compared to the amount of fossil generation that will be required. Natural gas is clearly going to be part of that picture, and probably the prevailing picture I guess probably for the next decade, at least, I would say, because there's a couple things at work there. One is the shale gas activities, and as you well know, Marcellus Shale is certainly growing. Utica Shale in Ohio, in that area. We also have Haynesville Shale, Eagleford, Fayetteville. All those are in our service territory, and you're seeing a very definite change in the way energy is produced from those kinds of resources, because now you may have less than $5 gas, at least I've heard from gas experts, less than $5 gas probably for the next decade. If that's the case, then you have basically prices on a marginal cost basis that compete with the marginal cost of coal. The capital cost of a natural gas-fired unit is probably on the order of a third to a half of a coal unit. So there's not going to be a coal unit that's put in place until there's a rational energy policy that answers those questions around coal, number one. And then secondly, you see an uptick in natural gas prices to support the development of further coal. So coal will drop to 39%. It probably will be that way for the next decade. And then once technology is proven, once we understand that we do need a balanced portfolio that includes everything from an energy policy perspective, you'll see coal start to come back. From a clean standpoint, we've already reduced. We've spent $7.2 billion on our system, putting scrubbers and SCRs in, selective catalytic reduction devices that eliminate SO2 and NOx emissions, smog emissions. So we spent $7.2 billion. We've already achieved 80% reduction in our fleet. Now we're being asked by the EPA, and we're prepared to do another $6 to $8 billion to eliminate the remaining 15 to 20%. Well, at some point, you have to think about what's the law of diminishing returns here. We really do have to think about it from a society perspective, because as an engineer, I'll tell you, if you tell an engineer to go make the system fully reliable, they're going to spend all kinds of money to make sure the system's fully reliable. It's all done within the context of some degree of rationality. We have to think about that from an environmental standpoint as well, because these central station facilities are the most efficient way for us to provide energy in a distributed fashion to customers, particularly as the economy continues to be electrified. We'll have our cars done before it's over with.
Sorry. So it costs half to a third as much to build a natural gas-based plant. I read that it's about 50% less, it's 50% cleaner to burn the natural gas in the plant than coal.
From a CO2 perspective.
Right, CO2, right.
From a CO2 perspective. And, you know, with our carbon capture and storage project.
Describe that.
We had a carbon capture and storage project, the first fully integrated capture and storage project right here in West Virginia at the Mountaineer Station, the only one in the world. And we were advancing the technology. We had a lot of international participation and interest in reviewing that facility because it clearly was state-of-the-art. In that project, we were eliminating over 90% of the carbon emissions from a coal plant. So it's a much higher standard than if you had a regular natural gas plant. It'll emit about 50%. So it was clearly the technology was moving in the right direction, and it's actually easier to remove CO2 from coal than it is from natural gas. So if you're able to achieve 90% emission reductions of CO2, it could wind up tilting back in the favor of coal. So there's those kinds of issues that have to be resolved over time, but it's important to realize that technology is advancing on all fronts, not just on the energy efficiency, the grid smart grid activities, but also with coal. We're building the first ultra supercritical coal unit in this country as well in southwest Arkansas, and that's a much more efficient coal, about 10% less coal used and 10% less emissions. Those are the kinds of advances that we need to make for all these technologies moving forward together, as opposed to excluding one or the other.
Well, we'll move on to another. Having lived in the evacuation zone for 3 Mile Island, I have to ask you, I mean, is there a future for nuclear, or did the most recent accident at the Fukushima nuclear reactor set us back another 15 years?
You know, I don't think it's set us back from the perspective that many people would think. That was a very definite, unique situation. And certainly from the tsunami that occurred, the unit actually operated the way it should have, but the tsunami took out all the backup associated with it. So you have to really think about, you're already having to consider earthquake activity here in the U.S. in areas that you wouldn't have thought of originally. So there's in the U.S. nuclear industry, it is unique, it is different, it is an extreme what we call defense in depth. We have a lot of support. We also have nuclear units, AEP does as well. And those units are very well protected. The analysis that's done is critical to the success of the future of the nuclear industry. There's two things here. One is the operations of nuclear units, which we very much demonstrate operational excellence in the nuclear fleet of the U.S. A lot of work still to be done from an international standpoint to have that kind of culture in existence. The other part of it, though, is the cost of nuclear. To build a new nuclear unit, like I said earlier, is a $7 to $8 billion proposition. The entire market capitalization of AEP is around $20 billion. So if you're going to spend $7 to $8 billion for a nuclear plant, you better be thinking you're going to actually recover that cost from somewhere, otherwise you're betting the company. So now you have units that are being built in Georgia, South Carolina, because there's legislative and regulatory support that enables you to finance that kind of construction. Southern Companies is doing that out of Atlanta. Nowhere else in the country is that occurring, and it likely won't occur. We were looking at building a third nuclear unit, but decided not to because, number one, we couldn't get adequate support to do it, and then secondly, the economy tanked, and it was a good thing that we didn't start that kind of project. So nuclear is different, but I think there's actually an analogy with the natural gas industry, particularly the shale gas activity. Nuclear has an effort where they review each other to ensure there's operational excellence because they depend on one another. If there's problems at a unit and across the globe, it's going to have implications to any construction cycle for nuclear here or the operations of existing nuclear. Natural gas is the same thing with the shale gas activity. You're only as good as the lowest common denominator in terms of operations. And that operational excellence is key, and I think the majors are recognizing that. We want that to be preserved as well. So certainly from a nuclear perspective, it's going to be a challenge. As long as we have an energy policy that's balanced, that is understood, that we can execute on, you will see nuclear re-enter the picture. I'm a fan of modular nuclear, small nuclear reactors. And those can be placed in if you have a 200 megawatt subcritical unit that's retired, you can put a 200 megawatt nuclear unit there. But obviously there has to be a commitment to do that. And right now, it's difficult to find that commitment from a financial perspective.
There's lots of talk and lots of people writing about renewable sources of energy production, whether that's hydro or solar or what have you. Are you investing in those alternatives? They now produce relatively small amounts of the energy that we use in the country. Do you really think that's going to change, or is it so expensive to produce it that isn't probably going to have a big impact.
We do. We have 2,000 megawatts of wind power. We also have hydro and solar as well. We also have smart grid activities like integrated volt-var control, which optimizes the power system so that more delivery of power and energy can occur over the same power lines. We also have community energy storage projects, battery technologies for neighborhoods. We're testing those as well, and we also have large-scale battery technology, sodium sulfide batteries, for positions on the grid, and I believe Apco has a couple of those. It's important to advance those technologies, but you have to understand the limitations, you have to understand the costs. Typically, we get mandates from a state or even national perspective. Renewable portfolio standard has been discussed at that level. Number one, it's not a one-size-fits-all. There are geographic differences on the availability of wind power or solar or anything else. Secondly, you really have to look at the costs associated with it. Solar power is going to be around 23 to 25 cents per kilowatt hour. Apco customers are probably paying on the order of 8.5 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So for those parts of the nation that are dependent upon coal, natural gas, and other things, it's a step change in rates. And typically what happens is you wind up in a situation where unknowingly policy drivers will say, well, we want to have 25% renewables, by 2025. I know West Virginia has a mandate, but it also includes alternative generation, which that's the kind of thing that you want to have, not something that severely limits to go after high-cost types of supplies. I think it's going to take time from the production cycle for solar, for rooftop solar, for other forms of solar to really catch up, but you can't force-fit it into particularly an economy or a pricing mechanism that makes sense. That's why, in the Northeast, they're already paying 20 to 25 cents a kilowatt hour, so they don't care about adding wind or anything else. But in the central parts of the U.S., it is an impact on the rates going forward, and we really have to think that through. Too many times, I think it's the Northeast and California driving energy policy in this country, and we really do need to have a voice for a more balanced approach as we progress.
So we're a little spoiled in West Virginia. So we're about the, I think, 9th or 10th state in terms of low cost, and we've enjoyed that for a while, and it may not keep on going for a long period of time.
Well, I think one point to make there is, it doesn't matter what you pay, you don't want to pay any more.
Right.
And if too many times our rate increases are based on percentage increases. Well, if you have a 3% increase on 25 cents per kilowatt hour versus 3% on 10 cents a kilowatt hour, it may be less of an increase, but it still is an increase for people on fixed incomes and people have difficulty paying their bills. And that's something that we really are concerned about. Apco has actually gotten ahead from the environmental retrofitting standpoint, but there's been inordinate increases as a result. And I think we really do have to think about optimizing that future spend so that we can mitigate those kinds of price increases. What the EPA is doing, for an example, to truncate basically 25% of the coal fleet in this country will increase rates on the order of 10 to 35% overnight. Why are we doing that in this type of economic environment, and why aren't we doing it in a sensible fashion that makes sense for the economy, that makes sense for the communities involved, is beyond me.
What are ways in which you as a company can be more efficient? If I read correctly, about for 100 units of energy that go into a steam turbine plant, you get about 35 units of energy out of it, which isn't very efficient. And there are loss of energy just from trying to transmit it across the wires and the grid and all of those things. Are there real promise for trying to increase those efficiencies, or is it just too hard to do?
No, that's happening all the time. Matter of fact, when we added scrubbers and SCRs, the environmental equipment, to our power plants, that actually increased the demand on the power plant itself on the order of 35 megawatts a unit. We made up for that by basically doing boiler revisions with new metallurgical aspects, tubing, all those types of things to make the unit more efficient, and we basically eliminated any capacity reduction as a result. So we lost about 600 megawatts of generation, basically just by adding environmental equipment to our plants, but we made up about 600 megawatts by optimizing with new technologies the efficiency of the plants going forward. And I think that's going to continue to be true. Our ultra supercritical is a higher metallurgical activity, a mix on tubing and so forth. It enables higher steam temperatures and more efficiency. The only issue with that is that they're only available out of China. And I think you're seeing manufacturing of that type move to China. The only place you're going to get a reactor vessel head for nuclear is out of Japan, because they're the only ones with large enough forges. I think the Europeans are also putting that in place. And I think when you look at it from a supply chain perspective, it is of real concern for this nation.
When something goes wrong in the grid, we all of a sudden realize that there's this gigantic grid and power is instantaneously shared across the country. One of the projects you're working on is a grid smart system.
Right.
And so what is the grid smart system? How does it work? And what's the potential?
I think it has a lot of potential. We have smart grid pilots, and our version of it's called Grid Smart Original, but that's what we call it. And we have pilots in Ohio, in Oklahoma, Indiana, and Michigan. And we really focus on advancing those technologies around battery storage, community energy storage is one that we're working on. We're finding out the supply chain isn't quite right from a quality control perspective yet, but we're learning from that, and I think that's important for us to do. Integrated volt-var control is an instantaneous measurement of, I'm probably going to get technical on you, but real power and imaginary power. You need imaginary power to run your motors and stuff like that. So you're constantly having to change what's called the phase angle. But anyway, it constantly changes both of them, so you can supply motors and so forth. So it automatically compensates for that. So it's more of a learning system and enables more power flow to occur over the same capacity lines. Those are the kinds of things that we can do to really raise grid efficiencies. Metallurgical aspects of new transmission lines are much better as well, so there's not as much losses. And then on the customer side of the meter, you really get into the point where you're really after energy efficient appliances. And many people don't realize their cable box that's left on all day consumes as much energy as their flat screen TV. I don't know if many people realize that, but there's all kinds of uses going on that you don't realize. And those are the kinds of things where we can really gain efficiencies. We found out, though, with the GridSmart pilots that customers really do want an easy button on their side. They want us to take care of the issues on our side of the meter, and really that's where probably the large benefit is.
So you're not very optimistic about being able to change human behavior and do all of those saving things that we brag about?
I think in the future you may wind up wanting to control some devices with your iPod or iPad or whatever. The younger generation certainly is more focused on those types of activities, but by and large, most people aren't going to sit on their computer and try and save $1 a month or whatever. I think there will be natural tendencies, though, to focus on as prices increase. Certainly, you become much more aware of your energy usage, and then at that point in time, I think the technology will take off, and the information will be more usable for customers. So it's in its early stages, but it's going to get there.
Yeah, people seem to be willing to spend a little bit more money to get an energy efficient appliance or a car, but monitoring those things on a daily basis is probably a little tougher. Let's talk about regulations. You are in a position where you have to spend a lot of money lobbying, trying to influence regulations so that they're favorable to the industry. How injurious are the regulations that you're dealing with now?
Well, I've talked a lot about the EPA. Hopefully, I guess we have EPA people here maybe. But I think the regulatory agencies, particularly, and it's in business in general during the last few years, but from an EPA perspective, is having a dramatic impact on not only the process customers will ultimately pay, but also our ability to meet those reliability objectives that we have. And I think that we do need a degree of rationality around the regulatory issues. From a local standpoint, the state regulatory agencies are much more responsive, in my opinion, because it's much more localized and they feel the impacts. And I think for us to continue to make advances, the state regulatory agencies really do need to speak up about what's going on the national front, because too many times it is a one-size-fits-all, and it may not be appropriate for the states that are involved. So I think it definitely is a challenge for us, and certainly it's a point where this nation, we provide a basic necessity of life as we know it. I mean, to do everything that you want to do requires some form of energy, mostly electrical energy, and we need to really be mindful of the changes we make as a society to really disrupt that. And for us, we're constantly trying to manage along several fronts. Certainly, the cost increases associated with it, but also from a technology perspective, making a transformation. This industry's been around for over 100 years. AEP's been around for over 100 years. And we'll continue to be around for another 100 years, where we're making continual transformations to address the energy concerns of our customers. Too many times from a regulatory standpoint, sometimes I think it'd be good if people who oversaw the system would go visit some other countries. If you ever had been to, I thought China was pretty interesting in itself. But India was interesting. I don't know if those of you have been involved or have been to India, but there's still electrification of the economy going on there, as well as China. But you see the emissions, you see the kind of world that they live in. It's nothing like here. I mean, the air, the water, everything we do is much cleaner than it ever was, not only in this country, but the cleanest on earth. And I think we have to respect that and also think about those basic necessities.
Yeah, one of the positions is that with regard to some of the regulations, you're not responding so much to the fact of having the regulation, but to the timing and the expectation about when you need to make the adjustments. You may want to flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, I'll take the latest EPA mandates. The cumulative impact of many of these rules are requiring us to put scrubbers and SCRs on units, replace existing capacity in a time frame that makes absolutely no sense. If we were to do everything by 2014, AEP had the largest construction program, second largest of anyone in the country, not just utilities, anyone, in 2008. We had about 8,500 contractors on our property at one time. We were scavenging the union halls, trying to find people who could work on our facilities. And from a pure workforce development issue, the labor just wasn't there. And this is craft labor, boiler makers, pipe fitters, electricians, and so forth. And to do what the EPA is asking, we'd have to have 25,000 on our property at one time. That's number one, it doesn't exist. Number two, it's impossible on these plant sites. And these projects, they were saying would take 3 years. Well, we know they take 5 years because the state commissions have to approve these kinds of investments. So you have to take these real-world implications that we deal with every day and really translate it into meaningful, consistent, and coherent regulation. OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, who oversees some of the regulatory activities, say that's exactly what we need. Well, that's not what we're experiencing. So there needs to be a change in that regard.
Okay. Help me out on this one. You are a for-profit company. Mm-hmm. You have signed, you're also publicly regulated.
Right.
And so you sign agreements with states to provide the power for those states, or areas.
Yeah. We're a regulated monopoly in most of the states that we do business in, integrated regulated monopoly. So the commissions decide what our return on investment is. We're limited in that, and typically a utility rate of return will be around 10 to 11% for equity. And that it is limited because it is an essential service. People have to have it, so it's natural in that occurrence. Now, we do have some states that are competitive states where the wires business continues to be regulated, but the generation business is not regulated. Even there, you have limitations on what can be charged through agencies that have been put in place to oversee it. So either way, it's regulated. It's a matter of which direction you go, but typically the returns are limited for integrated regulated monopolies like ourselves.
Okay. So along comes the need for you to spend $200 billion to do something. Mm-hmm. And you're being forced to do that because of technology changes and to meet regulations and all the rest. Aren't you just in a position where you're going to turn around and pass that on to the customer?
For integrated regulated monopolies, that's true. We would pass those costs on to customers with the allowed return on equity. Mm-hmm. And that's what's important for, most people within the Beltway in Washington don't realize that customers eventually bear the cost of the things that we're required to do. And even congressional members don't realize that to a large extent. And I think more education is needed in terms of how that process actually works. We invest capital, we invest it because, and the commissions allow us to invest capital in the right things, whether it's reliability of the grid, transmission, distribution, what generation is approved for recovery. We go build it, we invest it, and we get a regulated rate of return as a result.
But on the one hand, it would seem to me that the system is not encouraging you to be more efficient if there's a set rate of return. And so I'm not blaming the company, I'm just trying to think about how the system works. And yes, out of your own goodwill, I mean, you're interested in trying to keep down the cost to the customer, but the system itself doesn't seem to impose that on you.
I would
Except
say
you get lots of letters to the editor.
I would say, there is requirements for energy efficiency. I mean, we're one of the only industries probably that is incentivized not to produce more of our product. So we have those types of incentives in place. But then secondly, we have to be concerned about the rate increases that occur. I mean, there's so much that customers are willing to pay. And as we go forward with investments, we need energy efficiency to mitigate the amount of additional capacities that's required to meet the demand. And to the extent we can mitigate it, we're more able to control rate increases as a result. That's really the utility incentive, to try to shove through every additional cost and not try to be economical or efficient. It will not work in the utility model ultimately.
Okay. This is a little more down-to-earth question than the one I just asked you. About once a month, the electricity flickers off, so we have to go around and reset our clocks and everything else in the world. Why in the world do you have this electricity flickering for us? They didn't ask it quite that pointedly, but I'll throw it out there.
You know, in West Virginia, you have a lot of trees, and you've got tall trees that are right outside the right-of-way. and typically, you know, and just so you know, if it goes out, if it goes completely out and doesn't come back on, then it's locked out. Either a tree's on the line, or there's been a failure of a device. Typically, in a storm, you'll have 3 times and then it'll lock out. It'll flicker 3 times and lock out because there's something that's on the line. That's done that way for safety. Obviously, you don't want live wires hanging around all over the place, so we have to sectionalize whenever there's an outage. And the flickers are usually caused by either lightning strikes in the area, or it can happen by wind or facilities that are damaged in some way. So the electric system is built to take care of itself, and it takes care of itself instantaneously. Otherwise, you wind up with a significant amount of damage. The best thing that we ever did, in my opinion, was to actually get to the point where we can tell customers when their outage will be eliminated and their service will be back on. Because typically, when customers call, they want to know. I mean, I think they understand the situation. They just need to know when it's coming back, and it needs to be back when we say it's going to be back. So we've really focused our systems on providing that kind of input. We've also gone on to Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and other social media to have that same level of interaction, particularly when there's large storms and those types of things, so people can readily see what's going on with the system. So it's a challenge. I mean, it's a kind of system that we've built. It's all interconnected. It's dependent on each other across the system, and things happen.
The question is for Apco. You can expand it to American Electric Power. But does Apco have any new coal generation plants under serious planning for construction?
No, not at this point. I don't think anyone in their right mind in this environment would start a new coal unit. It would be natural gas, or it would be energy efficiency and those types of technologies and renewables.
With all of the reports of green economy investments not producing the jobs or returns that were promised by the stimulus package, should the government continue to try to stimulate green jobs?
I think there's a certain level of stimulation required to advance the technology, to get it to a price point that actually makes sense. Now, one thing about intermittency, as you may be aware, wind power and solar, obviously solar only works when the sun's shining, and wind only operates when the wind is blowing. And typically, if you think about in the hot summer, how often is the wind blowing? When it's hot. Last year in PJM, which is the RTO, the Regional Transmission Organization region that we operate in, they have 4,800 megawatts of, which is million watts, 4,800 megawatts of connected wind. Only 80 megawatts were running at the time of the peak. So if you're trying to flip your light switch on during the peak demand, you probably don't want to depend on a windmill somewhere. You're going to have some kind of capacity to back it up. So that's why when you look at the total cost of wind and solar, you have to take into account that it has to be backed up with capacity from somewhere else, typically a coal unit or a natural gas-fired unit. So that's one of the reasons. I mean, certainly wind power has its place. Solar has its place as an energy type of activity, but if you're adding capacity, it has to be more fossil generation in other forms.
Okay. Regarding nuclear,
by the way, I'm happy to say that we do focus on the development. Like I said, we have 2,000 megawatts of wind. We continue to add renewables. It has its place. My oldest son, who just graduated from college, called me during class one day or after class, and he said, "Dad, we were talking about you today." And I said, "Oh, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Toxins." and the vision of AEP historically has been a coal-fired utility, and in some quarters a dirty coal-fired utility, and we sort of need to change that thing. So we're going to be more balanced. Our coal units will be fully controlled. Natural gas and other forms of energy, nuclear and so forth, will be there. And after I told my son that this toxin paid for his college education, I explained to him that we are more than coal, but we are definitely an advocate of keeping coal in the picture.
Yeah. Regarding nuclear energy, if you look ahead 20 years, what fraction of our electricity will be generated with nuclear energy, and are the hurdles primarily technical or political?
I would say more political and cost, but probably cost is probably the biggest thing at this point. And I think you really do have to have a long-term view of capacity and energy and for the future, because typically a nuclear unit will be 40 years initial license, and you can extend 60, and there's some talking about extending the license to 80 years. You really do have to look at, to spread that capital cost. It actually is one of the cheaper forms if you take into account a long-term view. And that's what's critical for us, to have a long-term set of assets and a short-term set of assets. So for nuclear, the challenge will be from the cost side.
Please specify governmental policies that are counterproductive to the industry.
You're putting me on the spot.
Your friends out there.
No, yeah. I think one of the most counterproductive things is not to have an energy policy in this country. The vacillating back and forth from administration to administration is not making sense for long-term investment and the development of technologies and use of domestic resources. You know, and I don't mean to get too political on you, but to not allow the Keystone Pipeline, to not allow and have a big question about the development of shale gas. In some states, you can't do it, New York in particular. And then as well, to say no coal for the future, no nuclear, then what? And I think you do have to have an energy policy that we're able to act on, that makes sense, that we can truly mitigate and optimize costs for customers. That's one challenge. The other is, like I said before, this disconnect between the policy side, who really haven't experienced the industry, making rules that don't exist from a real-world standpoint. We have to bridge that gap. And for us, in our business, I think we're going to have to do a much better job of communicating effectively the value of the product that we provide and what it means to the backbone of this economy and the backbone of everything that we do. Those are kinds of messages that need to come across. And probably above all else, we need the two sides of the aisle actually working together to get something done.
You've talked about this in general terms, but 30 years from now, what will be the fuel makeup of AEP's generation?
30 years from now, I'd say it'd be much more balanced. We'll have, by 2020, we'll be 52% coal. Right now, we're 65% coal. That 52% will probably hold in to where the existing capacity is lowered somewhat. And then you'll see natural gas in a much bigger piece of the puzzle. Nuclear will pick up slightly because of nuclear uprates and perhaps future technologies associated with modular nuclear. And then renewables, energy efficiency will be a much larger piece as a result. I think the technologies of the future force us to, when we look at building a new generating unit, central station generating unit with a lifetime of 30 to 40 years, you really have to think about that based upon how technology is advancing. Technology is going to advance other forms, distributed generation, battery technologies, and so forth. I mean, battery technologies today, for the students in the room, probably you have a battery that runs lithium-ion or whatever the battery is for 4 hours. Well, lithium air in the next decade will move it to where it's 10 times with the same weight. So you can run it for 40 hours. For electric cars, the same thing will hold true. For the same size, it'll be tenfold in the next decade. Oh yeah, electric cars
just brings you more business, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it does that. But also, it's good for the environment, and it's also for urban areas can be quite successful. You're seeing charging stations show up across the country, and as car makers make the offerings more prevalent and more attractive, then you're going to see that develop even further. Also, most of the time, people will charge them at night, which is good for us from a valley filling perspective, is what it's called. But during the off-peak period where people aren't using much, if you're charging your cars, that'd be a great thing for us. Yeah. And it'll also reduce the cost to customers.
What's the role of geothermal power in providing America's power needs?
Yeah, I think there's a place for geothermal. It's obviously going to be locational. And there are specific parts of the country where it is prevalent. I think anything like that, and including CASE technologies, compressed air technologies used in underground caverns or other types of facilities will be used in the future. Perhaps used in concert with renewables so that you can effectively charge up a facility, either compressed air or so forth, to generate during peak times. So it'd be a good peak shaver. This valley fill, peak shaver, they're opposite. So.
What is the PATH transmission line, and what progress has been made on it?
Well, PATH is one of those projects that's on hold, clearly. After trying for, I guess, a couple of years, maybe even longer, to get the project all ready to go, it just couldn't get the approvals, and it was put on hold, which is interesting because we look at transmission. We have the largest transmission system, the only 765 kV system in the nation. And just to give you some backdrop to that, when we had the huge northeastern outage that went into Canada, it was that AEP 765 system that saved the rest of the eastern part of the country because it's a large transmission system with a lot of large generation, and it held up against all the transients that were occurring around the loss of transmission and generation in other parts of the nation. So it's key to have in view transmission as a resource, and we very definitely do that. The only problem in this country is siting of transmission and also getting the approvals for allocation of costs associated with transmission. The last 765 kV 765 transmission system line that we built took 16 years to build. Actually, it only took 2 years to build. It took 14 to get the permit to build it, and that's typical for transmission investments in this country. For generation investments, I told a group today. 2 years ago, I was at the 50-year anniversary of our Clinch River power plant in Virginia. And Clinch River was the largest unit of its kind built in the world when it was built. And I read the transcript of our chairman at the time, Philip Sporn. The governor was there and others, so they were talking about the unit coming online. And he said from the time we decided to build the generation to the time construction started was 2 months. Just 2 months. And we were trying to build an ultra supercritical unit in southwest Arkansas, and it took 2 years before we could even start doing anything. because of the permitting process. So it shows you what's happening around construction, around manufacturing, around those kinds of activities in this country today. And it's not sustainable. Something has to change as a result. Otherwise, manufacturing goes to other places. Generation can't be built, transmission can't be built, and that's going to impair the reliability of the system.
This might be a short answer question, not sure.
I'll try to answer short. Sometimes I answer questions too
I'm not
long.
trying to cut you off, I'm just forecasting here. Do you believe that energy efficiency, demand response, integrated resource planning, and more renewable energy production will help West Virginia transition to a cleaner energy future?
As I said earlier, it's part and parcel to an overall plan that includes everything. And I think that West Virginia clearly has coal resources, natural gas resources, wind power is available. Certainly energy efficiency, smart grid activities need to be done because you will need that to answer the demand of the future and to mitigate cost and to make sure that we're balanced. Because if natural gas blows out for because it's either going overseas or whatever, or the demand increases for natural gas, then you need to have a balanced portfolio to absorb the rest of the risk. So you do need everything.
I think that's yes. What do you see as the government's role in updating and securing our power grid?
The government certainly is involved with cybersecurity. I mean, that's certainly an emerging activity to preserve the integrity of the grid. They're involved from that perspective, and we as an industry need the government's involvement with that because we need to understand what threats exist associated with infrastructure in this country, in particular electric supply. And I think the government also should be involved from a technology development perspective. I know there's a lot of discussion about Cylindris and all the activities there, but you can do it in a very wise fashion such that demonstration projects to really advance to commercial scale, new technologies is important. There's plenty of places where you can do research for benchtop type development of new applications, but it's more difficult to get demonstration projects going. That's one reason why our carbon capture and storage project didn't go to the next level. So that's definitely a place where the government can really focus on, and it all has to be in context of that energy policy that makes sense, and there has to be a forward view.
Okay. I think this is what you're talking about, but the Mountaineer plant sequestration program has apparently failed. Can you explain why that happened, and will underground carbon sequestration ever be viable?
You know, the project didn't fail. The project was a resounding success. What failed was funding. We AEP, spent over $100 million putting a 20-megawatt project in place at that plant that was the first capture and storage activity. The upscale project, moving to more of a commercial scale at 235 megawatts, would have cost $664 million. And the DOE was supporting it to the extent of $332 million, but that left a $332 million gap. That was either going to be borne by customers of the regulated utilities, particularly Apco, but also from an international standpoint, it was difficult to get investment because there was no price for carbon. If we had wound up with Waxman-Markey type legislation, then you would have had a price for carbon and probably could have got investors. But obviously Waxman-Markey had its own issues. So it was important for us to put that project on hold. We did complete the front-end engineering design for the upscale project. We have it on the shelf, ready to go, and when funding or timing associated with climate change legislation resurrects itself. It was a resounding success, though.
But
really
can we
was.
foresee a time when that process is going to be economically feasible?
Yeah, I think probably one of the clear first steps is to have carbon capture in the context of enhanced oil recovery, because enhanced oil recovery can provide a revenue stream, and by enhanced oil recovery we can inject carbon and improve the output of oil and natural gas facilities. So that's important for us to advance. That's one way it can be done from a commercial standpoint that's being worked out today. The other part of it is we need to find uses for carbon. China calls their programs CCUS, which is carbon capture and uses, and they're focused on uses of carbon. They use it for Coca-Cola, which I suppose is temporary sequestration, but nevertheless, but it is certainly an avenue to be looked at, because it's important for us to find a use for carbon. That way we don't have to store as much underground.
What changes have been made since the 2003 East Coast blackout to prevent it from happening again?
Certainly there's been a lot more focus on setting of relays, of interaction from a communication standpoint between various agencies and the regional transmission organizations. We have regional transmission organizations that monitor flows across large boundaries, and we've improved the communication not only between those entities, but also between the operating companies like AEP and those agencies as well. So that communication has dramatically changed to where we're much more responsive. The other thing too is education of dispatchers that dispatch a system and really focus on the processes. And somewhat like the nuclear industry, you have to have training as a system operator on this grid, because it is one of the most challenging jobs there is, and they really do need to be focused on the system and understand the electrical issues involved to adequately operate a power system and to be able to respond in outage type scenarios. So we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go, because I think there has to be a lot more interaction between generation, transmission, and distribution, because you're seeing now distributed generation. So you really have to coordinate those types of activities across the board.
At one time, AEP was a strong supporter of cap-and-trade legislation. Are you still?
It depends on the circumstances. We supported Waxman-Markey, and the reason why we did support Waxman-Markey is because, first of all, there were credits and allowances that were distributed to end users like power companies to mitigate the cost increases associated with addressing climate change. We were trying to protect our customers in that regard, because if you remember at the time, it was pretty clear that climate change legislation was moving forward. And to us, it appeared, well, we better get on board and get the best deal that we can for customers. And by getting allowance allocations, we were able to offset the cost increases associated with it. The other thing, too, is it really defined a framework for the investment in carbon capture and storage facilities. It not only incentivized, but it provided through Representative Boucher had presented a process where you could have a fund set aside for the development of demonstration projects that would advance carbon capture and storage, and then allowances were paid based upon how much CO2 you were able to sequester. So it really had that business case behind it as well. Those two things were incredibly important to us because of our position in coal, and we had to move forward with that. It didn't succeed, Actually, the whole climate change debate in this country has waned for a period of time, but it'll come back.
Okay, forecast, it'll come back. Wouldn't renewables be immediately cost competitive if we priced energy sources by their total impact on society and the environment, including acid runoff in streams, mercury in the food chain, respiratory health problems, and the enormous consequences of climate change?
Well, I think that clearly there's societal costs that aren't included, and when we evaluate what type of generation to use, I mean, we already put in a carbon cost associated with it. As far as the health benefits or the health costs, when you look at the amount of mercury emissions, for example, from one of our power plants, our mercury standard is about the size of one ping pong ball if you filled the Astrodome with ping pong balls. That's how much mercury we're getting out of the system before anything's ever emitted. And I don't know about you, but I used not to diminish the idea, but I used to roll around mercury on the chemistry table, growing up. But
it's a different world.
It's a different world, but again, you have to really think about the effects on the environment. You look at the full suite, and AEP has been very focused on working with our sustainability partners, mainly in the environmental community, for the last 5 years to really get an understanding of the issues involved. And we've actually reached back to coal suppliers because there was a lot of concern about the impacts of coal mining, particularly mountaintop mining, and focused on the credibility of the operations associated with those facilities. We do surveys of all of our coal operators, and we evaluate based upon the performance of those operators, and most operators are very credible in what they do. But it's important for us to look at that entire value chain, and we do that. But that being said, we still need coal. We still need natural gas. And if anyone's trying to eliminate that and do something different, it's just not going to happen.
Okay.
And that's the real world speaking.
Would you rather be a regulated or unregulated utility?
Depends on which state. No,
there's no press coverage. You can just run with that one.
No, I'd much rather be a regulated utility because I think the long-term investments that are needed, the kind of business that we are in, it really lends itself to being a regulated entity. And when it's integrated like that, you have a lot more discussion about what the options are. On an unregulated entity, sure, you can probably do better from an earnings perspective. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative, depending on the market. But at the same time, you want to be able to credibly make investments. This is a different industry than anything else. I mean, most people think of competitive industries. I can make soap, and it's probably it'd probably be okay to be a competitive industry because you can decide whether to buy soap or which kind of soap. But for the electric utility industry, it's imperative that demand stays ahead of supply, and it has to stay ahead in that we're making supply decisions years in advance, because to construct, to do the things that we need to do for approvals and so forth, you have to be ahead of the demand. Otherwise, you have what I call a crude form of demand-side management, and that's blackouts. And that's not something that this economy is served by. There are countries that are literally having to deal with that, like South Africa and others, that are having to shut down during the day so that they can run their power system, and they have to take industrials off and so forth. That's not a nation that is sustainable in that regard. So if you go to a competitive industry, it's important to have price signals in the market that support the development of supply side resources. If you don't have that, you'll constantly lag, prices will be much higher, and reliability will be compromised as a result.
A couple more things. The Kanawha River Apco facility is scheduled to cease operations in 2014. Can it be retrofitted for a natural gas plant economically?
I think the issue there is we have 6,000 megawatts of subcritical 200 megawatt units, roughly 2,000 in the Apco territory. There's another 2,000 in Ohio. And we're only replacing 6,000 megawatts, about 1,500 to 1,800 megawatts of that, because the economy certainly has had a downturn. And also energy efficiency, renewables, demand-side management, those types of activities are becoming more prevalent. So we're not going to replace it all. The value of Kanawha, though, is I'm much more of a fan of putting new natural gas-fired capacity as opposed to repowering or refueling, because it's much more efficient, much more sustainable for the long term. The value in Kanawha's site is that we have a site there that is a brownfield site in that transmission already exists, substations already exist for the distribution of power and energy, and the site is there ready to go. So we're evaluating all of our retired sites. We'll keep them because they are the best places for a new generation. And if the economy picks back up, we'll see construction begin on those types of facilities.
What infrastructure plans, if any, do you have to fuel electric cars?
What kind of production facilities?
Infrastructure.
Infrastructure. Oh, okay. So as part of the GridSmart pilot that we have, we're putting charging stations in various communities that are part of the testing process. We are also testing different types of chargers at our Dolan Labs facility. We have one of the only utility R&D facilities. Dolan Labs, what it's called, but we take those technologies and evaluate it. So what we're trying to do at this point is determine, okay, what's the best technology to put out there, also evaluating what to do in the home as a result, and hopefully at some point we'll have tariffs that provide for the development of 220 socket connections for faster charging in a garage, for example. And of course, working on home standards to where you start to have that kind of built-in process as well. It's key for the development of those technologies.
Yeah. When you bounce out of the bed one morning and you're as optimistic as can be about the future of the world, what is the nature of your optimism about the future of your business?
Oh, I think as long as we're credibly able to transform ourselves to an energy supplier of the future rather than assume we're going to stay the way we are, we'll be successful. And clearly, when I came into this business, it was just a matter of how much load was going to increase and how much new central station generation you were going to put in place. Today, you not only have differences in customer usage patterns on the one hand, you also have differences in technologies that are becoming more prevalent, even disruptive technologies that eliminate transmission, distribution, and generation. So we have to be able to develop a platform of energy resources and services that enable our customers to make those kinds of choices. I think capacity segments that are added in the future will be smaller. I think they'll be much more responsive, and we'll have to make sure that the cost of that kind of thing doesn't disrupt the economies that we serve. But I think there's a bright future for this industry if it's done correctly. If we have an energy policy, that'd really help.
Well, we wish you well in your leadership of AEP. Thank you for letting us grill you tonight. So thanks to Nick Akins for sitting in with us.
Thank you, Dr. Webb.